this is Chaplain Tom McRee for our community Bible study for Thursday, February the 25th, 2021. This is the second of our series during the season of Lent, leading up towards Easter. I'm following the daily discipleship study guide from courtesy of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. You can go to their website and download any of these. They're actually very helpful. We are reading in the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to read Mark chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. The title from the author of this study guide calls it Beyond Oneself. And the question that he poses for us is, what does it mean to take up your cross and follow Jesus? The key verse is verse 34. If any want to be my followers, Jesus said, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. So let's read the entire section. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, Get thee behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. And Jesus called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said to them, If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? And for what can a man give in return for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. Mark 8, 31 through 38. So it's important to always keep the passage we're studying in the context of what's before and after. And so in the previous verses, you may remember that Jesus asked the disciples what people were saying about him. Probably to get an idea of whether they were clear. Plus, it also was an idea where he could ask them directly, but who do you say that I am? And Peter speaks up boldly and quickly. He gets the answer. He knows what's going on here. He declares Jesus is the Messiah. It is Peter's great declaration of faith. It is Peter's great moment to also show to us how, as a leader in the early church, he is very clear about who Jesus is and will be a good leader. And then immediately afterward, we have this section where Jesus talks about what is coming, the reality of that, of the death, of his death and resurrection. And it's clear that they were not ready for this. And Peter, of course, speaks up very quickly because he is not ready for such news. He did not expect to hear that Jesus was going to die, and probably didn't even hardly hear the resurrection in 3 days and the rest of the story. That just stunned him. And so Peter pulls Jesus aside because he thinks of a different future. And he just says he has good intentions. He's trying to correct Jesus. Well, Peter liked to speak his mind. But he's trying to persuade Jesus that he doesn't have to die. You know, I wonder if he says that out of fear, because he doesn't want to lose this friend and Lord and Messiah and the one to whom he's dedicating his life. So in just a few verses, Peter goes from being complimented because he recognized Jesus as the Messiah to being called Satan because he's getting in the way of Jesus's plans. So why was this so hard for Peter to hear? Well, probably because he already had some idea what he thought was going to happen, or maybe he just thought things were going to continue the way they were, and he did not anticipate Jesus' long-range plan, and he didn't anticipate that the animosity of those who wanted Jesus to be out of their way would just grow and become too powerful for Peter to resist. So why was Jesus so tough on Peter? He called him, "Get behind me, Satan." Well, first he got Peter's attention, I'm sure. But secondly, I think the message was, you're with me or you're against me. I have a plan. If you're following me, we're going to work the plan. And getting in the way of that is giving in to the powers of evil. Jesus wanted to make it clear which path that he was taking. And he wanted to prepare Peter and the others for the future, because it was not going to be an easy future. And they needed to know that and begin to prepare for it. So Jesus then turns to the whole crowd and he sets a high standard for all of them. He is telling them that they need to make a commitment and they need to be willing to make sacrifices to follow him. If any want to become my followers, they must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Now, they may not have understood the implications of the cross for Jesus, but they did know that the cross was one of the ways that the Romans would execute people. And so that phrase was certainly clear. These are not popular words. I wonder how many in the crowd heard that and decided they weren't going to go any further. Maybe they were embarrassed and didn't just get up and walk away, but maybe they slowly made their way to the back of the crowd and left. I suspect there were a few. So they knew that carrying a cross meant you were going to your death. And so to imply that following Jesus might be a death sentence, that must have been a difficult thing for many of them to swallow. So can you imagine Peter and the disciples even maybe seeing people begin to leave and wonder, boy, this is not going the way in which they thought it might go? Well, we might ask ourselves the same question. Who in reality wants to deny themselves? We want to enjoy ourselves. We want to make the best of life. We want that box of chocolates, and we don't want any empty places in there. We do not want to deny ourselves. And who wants to sacrifice? As the author says in our notes, this is not a positive marketing strategy. Oh, yes, we've got something for you, but you're going to have to sacrifice. We've got something for you. It may lead to your death. No. But the way of Jesus was not an easy path, and it's not an easy path today. Jesus is calling his followers to go against what might be some of the prevailing cultural norms, to go against perhaps family and friends, to be willing to say, this course is important enough that I'm willing to follow it no matter what may happen. Jesus is calling his followers not to think of themselves or the human things that we tend to think of quickly. He's asking his followers to think about the spiritual and the divine. What is God's plan and how is it going to work in our lives? Following Jesus is not for those who are undecided or just lukewarm. And throughout the Gospels, we see of people who come to Jesus and turn away. Jesus wants his followers not to be ashamed of him, to be willing to follow him. He turns things upside down. Those who cling to possessions, who cling to their life, will certainly lose them. Those who lose their life will gain so much more. So Jesus is really challenging people here in this passage. It's only the second week in the season of Lent. We've got, if I count right, there's 6 weeks and there's 40 days when you don't count the Sundays. But we're already having an intense message. It's not building slowly, it's building pretty dramatically. If you look at those 40 days, Jesus is already here in this early part of our study, demanding what it takes to be true disciples. Not an easy path, perhaps sacrifice, perhaps suffering, and at the very least, service to other people. So what do you think? Do you think it would be better if Jesus made it easier for everybody? You know, growing up in the United Methodist Church, I thought it was a pretty good thing that there was a 6-week confirmation series when I was, I think, about 12 years old. We had to go on Saturday mornings and spend that Saturday mornings with the pastor for 6 weeks. And then it was clear that you would have learned enough to understand the decision you were making to be confirmed as a member of the Church of Christ, to follow through on the baptism that your parents had already declared for you. I then, when I became Lutheran, discovered that, that's 6 weeks on Saturday mornings is nothing. Many Lutheran churches have a 2 or 3 year study program, and in the old days, in many churches, then one had to be willing to endure questions, and sometimes those questions and that grilling was in the middle of a Sunday morning service with whoever was there could ask whatever question they want. And so it was not an easy thing for so many to know and to learn and to make a commitment. And so, is it better if we make it easier or not? What is lost if it becomes too easy to follow Jesus? Now, I do think there's a difference here, and some may disagree with me. For many congregations, many churches, they believe that there should be a high standard for people to join the church, and that one must follow certain doctrines and follow certain behavior and go through a certain study to be part of that church. And I will not fault them for that. I tend to think the church is one that goes out and reaches and is more of an umbrella for people, whether they're very committed or a little bit committed or not really sure at all, but they think they found a group of people that they can work with or serve with. And so I tend to think that having that tough standard to be part of the church, that's not how I prefer. I do think, though, that the more one grows, the more one realizes that Jesus has a pretty high standard. And when we are ready and mature in our faith, then we can begin to live up to those higher standards that Jesus is saying. You know, these aren't just idle words. They were just words at that point that people were hearing. But it wasn't long afterward that Jesus was indeed going to pick up a cross and die. He means what he says, and I'm sure the disciples later on, when they saw that, had an even clearer idea of what was going to happen. The way of the cross is not a theory. It's not an intellectual exercise. It is a calling. It is a radical calling. It calls us to be against a society that encourages serving ourselves first, with the conflict of serving the betterment of all people and the following of what Jesus and our Lord wants us to do with our lives. I think there's quite a conflict in our modern society, and this is really probably not that much different than it's been always, but it's very clear today that we remember that there is a difference between living with Christian values and secular values. And it's not just church against state or church against community, because I think an awful lot of what we hear in our churches has been influenced far more than it should be by secular values. And so we really should read the words of Jesus carefully, because he makes some pretty good distinctions between those who are the religious leaders and those who need the help of the great physician. So Christian values and secular values, talk to me sometime and I'll tell you what I think about that. But I don't think it's what most of us tend to think of. We tend to follow our leaders and how they define that. And I personally feel like many of our church leaders in America are wrong. And I'll just leave it at that. The other is the moral and ethical stand that we can take for our Christian values that may be different than the political and the social stands. So I suspect that if we truly follow the morals and ethics and the way that Jesus lived his life, that we would find ourselves not fitting well into any political group and probably being critical of most political groups in one way or another, and also in social groups as well. You know, we talk about young people and teenagers and their peers and how they're influenced. And I dare say that doesn't end when they become adults. We adults are just as good at following the crowd and not paying attention to the words of Jesus. So Jesus here is offering a radically different approach. He's calling for people to follow him and to deny themselves. It's not going to be just a nice, protected, easy path. It's going to include sacrifice and suffering. So think about our own lives. Think about how we have grown in our lives in following Jesus, and what has that changed? What was some of the hardest things to do? What are some of the things that aren't so hard but they're enjoyable? What helps you and me from getting complacent and being relaxed about this call that Jesus has made? Sometimes we need to ask ourselves these hard questions, and that's what Jesus is encouraging us here. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Lutheran minister and a great writer who died before he saw the end of World War II. But he wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. The Cost of Discipleship. And he challenges the reader. He says, the cross is laid on every Christian. As we embark upon discipleship, we surrender ourselves to Christ in union with his death. And so we give our lives to him. And so the cross is not this terrible end, but in some ways it's the beginning. If we are willing to sacrifice, if we are willing to follow him no matter what, then that's the beginning of being a true disciple. It's not the end. Bonhoeffer warns his followers warns the followers of Jesus not to understand what he calls cheap grace. Grace is not cheap. There is a cost. And so when we pick up our cross, we shift our hands and spirits to lift it and to make room for it in our lives. And so we might think, what is it that we need to take up and think about that might be different in our lives? That's part of why we read these passages in Lent. It's a time of self-reflection and of being really brutally honest with ourselves. So, take up your cross, follow him. The suggestion here is that you draw a cross on a piece of paper, and in each quadrant, you've got 4 of them, write something that you might let go of so you can follow Christ more fully. Write something that you can let go of in order to follow Christ more fully. I will share my 4, and I gave them some thought, I will tell you. First is resentment. And I am aware that there are times in my life when I've been hurt or unhappy with something, and I have carried feelings of resentment along when it has been detrimental. And I hope at this point in life I catch that early enough to not cause too much harm. But resentment is something I need to sometimes let go of. The other is ego. You know, I have an ego just like anybody else. And sometimes it grows a little too strong. And sometimes I need to set that aside. The third of my things that I need to let go of is fear. Because I think when When I become afraid or worried about something, whether it's the future or finances or something going on, then that changes how I deal with stuff. And usually I become more tight and controlling and worrying. Fear, I need to let go of fear and trust God a lot more. And then the fourth one is perfectionism. I set a high standard for myself. I don't certainly meet that high standard a lot. But the idea of trying to be perfect, of trying to do everything just right, isn't helpful. It's good to do your best and give it your all, but also to learn to forgive and accept oneself. So those are my four things: resentment, ego, fear, and perfectionism. And you can tell me how you think I'm doing sometime. So let us pray. Gracious God, expand our vision so we can see things from your perspective. So give us courage and insight and the strength to pick up our cross and follow you in whatever we need to let go of so that we can have the life that you have now and forever. Amen. God bless you. Have a good week.